Hello everyone, today we talk about sources, about the Roman military as a general introduction to some authors, some historians of classical antiquity that described in fact the fiercest military machine of the era, leaving an important literary, historiographical, but in this sense also strategic legacy in our understanding of ancient warfare. You know that we made really lots of videos about the Roman army, and it feels as if we hadn't even properly begun, right? There are huge gaps that we left open for some reason. We never really talked too much in depth about the Punic Wars. I am making up for the lack, believe it or not, on Wikimedia Commons that is a pretty wide source of imagery of actually anything explainable about the Polybian army. So I have to create, through my own art and some AI filter to ensure full historical accuracy, my own Astati, Principes, Triari, Equites, Velites, and so on. And some of you are also interested in sources in general. You know that on Schwerpunkt, even that we are on YouTube, etc., I do not formally cite everything. I do not offer sort of bibliographies in the single videos. If anything, there are many philosophical reasons, primarily the critique to today's world, like you just give a source and people are automatically assuming that you're reliable in that or you're accurate, whatever they think. That's not how things really work. You can be hyper accurate without having cited really without having at least used a bibliography. Ask Kantorovitz for that matter, and his Frederick II. However, the most naive idea is that simply people are going to eventually read this stuff just because you give them a list that, by the way, everybody can write at this point, even faking it just through AI, saying, give me a historiographical reference, like a bibliographical list of sources of works. So to show that we're acting as if we were actually accurate and precise. Therefore, I decided to this was just in the among the so-called cycle topics at some point, so it's nothing new. We also talked at some point about different authors. We talked about Byzantinistics, for example. I have something coming in the following weeks about medieval historiography as a whole, which is a broader inquiry on sort of the ways, if anything, we conceived the Middle Ages. We talked a bit about princely Germany in the same terms. Today we talk about some of the most important authors in Roman military historiography, so to say, or better again, those authors that talked about the Romans at some point, could be also non-Romans at some point, and or coming from defeated peoples, also for the enthusiasts of the the pretty disappointing cliche that history is written by the winners. Because we want to show essentially who these people were, what kind of period we're looking at. We'll also be talking about authors that are very rarely cited because they are minor indeed, but still have something important to say. Just showing you a bit how complex the entire work is. I made a video back in the day titled Approaching the Study of the Roman Army or something like that. And we talk about the sources there, the method, how we should essentially think that. Today we do something slightly different because we focus on the historical figure of the scholar, of the authors of these histories, of these military treatises at times. I have also one section of the Schwerpunkt, as you know, dedicated to military theory, explaining essentially what it meant for example, strategists, tacticists to write manuals on this topic. Who they were, how were they considered? Consider that the Romans didn't have a word for strategy. That, as you know, is Greek. But, of course, the ways of war were different, not in the sense as we have actually learned on von Clausewitz that war, in fact, doesn't have some fundamental axioms within that. Also, von Clausewitz says that warfare always changes, but that's the that's at the level of the definition. It means that it's declined according to the different political, social context of that moment, and the same military dimension, the campaign, the theater, the opponent faced, and so on. in the sense that, yeah, that always changes, but there is a fundamental mechanism that we have actually assessed talking about ancient warfare as medieval and any other eras, meaning that there is not really a specific way of war pertaining just to antiquity or the Middle Ages, especially the latter is an even more contentious aspect, let's say. What happens in antiquity naturally is the development of the art of war in some more, at least conventionally recognizable fashion, and also for the spread of thoughts that are more relatable to our own. I mean, the way you read Polybius is the way you read really a person of 2025. Like, it's so modern, so straightforward. That's the miracle, the genius of Hellenic, also especially theoretical thinking. But in fact, there is a military practice that in that case, and we will see it now because we will talk about Polybius as well, is another story and must be reconstructed unavoidably through sources. Remember always that von Clausewitz derived his method from military historical studies other than just, military practice. That naturally was the most important chunk of that, but he says himself needs to be perfected by a diachronic comparative studying of the same. And this practice aligns very well according to some basic principles of the art of war. Right. For example, classical Hellenic, if you want, politic warfare is very straightforward, thanks to Thucydides, to Herodotus, to Xenophon, etc. We are really reading some very rationalized narratives of battles that make sense at the end of the day. May have been educational, may have been rounded up a little bit in the aforementioned theoretical Hellenic thinking that gravitated around the concept of perfection and absolute foundations, etc. And this kind of help, especially when you eliminate the modernistic veil on these topics, as we illustrate also in a recent video about Hellenic hoplite, the classical Hellenic hoplite training and equipment, because you realize that all our historiographical niches defining more or less these periods and trying to outline like the new firework terminology that categorizes and basically disintegrates the entire reality into some sort of non-communicating branches, which is the problem of today's hyper-specialization. Is not useful at all as far as war is concerned. Right? It's much more, first of all, why these sources? Because if you study just these sources, you will receive like a much greater insight than basically any kind of secondary scholarship from them. Of course, you should be somehow military literate. You should know Greek, ancient Greek, and Latin very well. That's not an option, really. If you don't know these languages, it's going to be very difficult to just approach a bit the entirety of history, even the contemporary one for that matter. Remember, we will start also a series about Indo-European etymology compared Indo-European languages, etc. And their deeper meanings, right? So you should be a bit sensitive to that as well. But indeed, for example, if you look at Schwerpunkt, say, dealing with the aforementioned classical politic battles, we normally just read those, couple of sources, or really that, talk about this battle, say, of the Peloponnesian War and Persian Wars, and they're very insightful. Sometimes they are also very complex. They do require some historiographical sort of framing. That there are, of course, some inconsistencies here and there, but overall, you realize that just through that study, something much more traditionally accurate appears than the modernistic notion of hoplitism. For example, you understand in that sense how both the so-called sort of politic heresy, but even more paradoxically, it's debunking, are just some kind of mental masturbations of 21st century scholars that happen just in some branches of the academia in the world. And if you had just studied with a sound educational background, just from reconstructing these battles from the primary sources, you would have never even fallen into kind of ideas of that kind. Because again, primary sources are superior to scholarship. Remember that, especially in the Anglosphere, where scholarship is sort of mythologized as way more important for some reason than primary sources, that at least I can't guarantee you that, like, you have to take my word, but it's not much just the fact that I have a continental European background, but it's mostly the matter that to us, like it was in our academic tradition, primary sources are more important than scholarship, all right? Scholarship doesn't come to fix the past, right? Also because they rely on those sources. So there isn't the magic source appearing, archaeology, other materialistic thing. No, like the only way to understand history is narrative sources. And there are historical reasons why that bias came about. And I also was raised, in a sense, especially in my parallel work through Anglo-American publications, towards whom I'm very grateful for having, in fact, looked at also some other aspects of military, historiographical topics, approach, whatever. But in this sense, you must be aware of also becoming independent, being able to see this from the outer side and realizing what are the limits in any approach, because there is never like a fully, absolutely perfect approach, if not von Clausewitz's, that unfortunately is being criticized as well by people who probably have never even opened the Von Kriege. And I literally, trust me, Keegan has never literally opened the Von Kriege. And I can certify that for him, right? And these are people who taught at Sander. I mean, we are really entrusting the study of history, military history, to people that, in my opinion, do not really have the moral and scientific fundamentals to be able to claim any authority on these matters. In any case, today we proceed with essentially a list of figures, some of which we have discussed already, for example, in a strictly historical, sometimes also military point of view, such as Marcus Porcius Cato. Others we discussed many times, such as the aforementioned Polybius, just because he's one of my favorite authors, of course. The other day we read Appian regarding the Battle of Pharsalus, then there is also Vegetius. So it's a bit of a melange. It's not overly comprehensive of everything. We will not talk, for example, Caesar. That, again, is also one of our favorite sources. It has one of the most beautiful Latin narrative that you can find, especially Latin oath, because most of these are Hellenic, as you understand, even when they were technically Roman, as Roman citizens of recent acquisition, also such as Polybius with Flavius Josephus, that defy again the myth that it's the winners really that write history. But if you again are aware of the differences between ancient Greek and Latin, you will very well know how especially classical Latin is really much denser, much more traditional, much more meaningful, much more military-minded than the Hellenic, that travels on some sort of more Hyperuranian field sometimes, but in the sense a bit out of touch with the also with the actual I don't want to say human, I would say mankind dimension of warfare itself, and the preponderance of moral forces, the fact that the fallen kind is really dirty and imperfect, etc. And so in order to take over the world and redeem it, the saying, well, trust the Romans in how they narrate warfare through their sagas, because it's something much more straightforwardly closer to the Clausewitzian mentality than Hellenic thought, for that matter. However, so far for the introduction, let's make the video agile. I will keep like the originary names of these authors in their original language. Aeneas Tacticus, or Aeneas Tacticus, 4th century BC. Right here, it's sort of in between classical and Hellenistic dimension. Aeneas Tacticus, which naturally was nicknamed like this because of his work, possibly from Stymphalos in Arcadia, was an Hellenic writer who authored the Polyarchetica, which you can sort of creatively translate as the defense of a besieged city. The earliest recorded treatise on military strategy per se, which makes it all the more interesting. This became a cornerstone for all subsequent works on the subject, and therefore you have to be quite appreciative, especially of the fact that it talks from a time where much of the same Hellenistic warfare was being in theory. All right, and so some of the same basis on which the Romans eventually developed their military machine were being forged at this point. Research suggests he had a practical military experience because these men were at large aristocrats who had evidently enough time to have their works dictated to their slaves, doing so from a position of authority. That you see, this is very important. These works for classical antiquity are largely devoid of actual sources, meaning that sometimes, there is a general reference, of course, to whom, saying what, etc. But first of all, we don't have that information. Very often, there was also a level of oral tradition passed down through the military circles, in politics, etc., and or common knowledge of some sort. These men were also knowledgeable in many other fields. And so their work is a work of art, as not much as polymaths per se, but in still having that kind of ancestrally condensated traditional understanding of the fluidity of reality, especially the Greeks at this point really rocked on in terms of styling, of theorizing, etc., and therefore are quite important and useful, especially for military manuals, right? So, unfortunately, we do not... What were the sources of Polybius? This is a giant of military, of historiography in general. We don't know. We literally have no clue who they were. I mean, we can, of course, make educated guesses, speculations, but we're talking about milieu, individuals, circles in general, the Scipiones, for example. But and not only those, of course, but the actual sources and other written ones, by the way, that already existed, of course, at that point, we have no clue. And we have, again, no clue of all the possible influences that would have been there. These were big worlds, by the way. When you look at classical antiquity, you realize that there is just the tip of the iceberg. Just for the Middle Ages, that people somehow still think to be dark ages that had less production than antiquity, were less developed than to have, in part also because they're closer to us, an overwhelming amount of documentation. A fiercely advanced level of documentation compared to anything antiquity ever produced. And in this sense, the impression also, given that I'm a medievalist myself and I often compare, different eras in this regard, is that, of course, we're looking at a much broader range of military historical debate, production historiography. As you know, Augustus wrote a treatise on tactics. One of the greatest tragedies of in the history of mankind, absolutely beyond, many massacres of lost people. Who cares about that? It's the fact that we lost what Augustus wrote about tactics, which it's something insane. We're not talking about many other works in the sense that we know were there and were lost. Pyrrhus, military treatise. My God, yet another tragedy. One of the things for which you should wake up in the morning and starting to cry just because, well, unfortunately, that is the case. But we understand in this sense that the scope of this all was much broader, as much as there were other sources, other levels of reality were described that were much more crowded than what we have. For example, the bias that we think that, the ancient world was just about big empires that made big battles and there is nothing in between. Whereas the Middle Ages were mostly raids or skirmishes, right? First of all, it's not true. Actually, pitched battles in the Middle Ages were quite frequent. We're not talking about other normal engagements that, however, just historiographically, we know they were there, but nobody records in books because, why would you do that? You must have a specific reason for that. They are, however, documented thanks to, again, the literal explosion of chronicles that allow us to study that, and for, of course, the incredibly chicken-brained modern perspective that, of course, doesn't understand absolutely anything about reality and tries to hysterically alienate from it at all costs, not to assess the the traumatically radical moral, personal, and cultural inferiority and moral and scientific subnormality of the contemporary era, for which, again, we decided that the Middle Ages were not as beautiful as classical antiquity, but also in that sense not military performing, as much as we sort of gave to classical antiquity some kind of more statuary appearance without much sort of shades and smaller activity that we would have definitely been incredibly appreciative of if we accepted, for example, that antiquity at large was largely like a big feudal world, just like the Middle Ages, even among the Greeks and the Romans, in that we should be really learning from these worlds much more carefully. Now, going back to Aeneas Tacticus, again, we think that he was likely a general or some kind of commander in the same Peloponnesian War. So back in the day, mostly, compared to his work, or his aftermath, because again, also the biological the biographical information of this guy is not really known, chronologically speaking. But given his detailed and pragmatic nature of his work, we suppose that this may have been the case. In any case, lots of things were happening at that point. Think about the so-called Iphicratean reforms that we discussed on Schwerpunkt, battles like Leuctra. I made a video about that. So that's the moment. And as you know, it's a very seminal one, also because what we will understand how Hellenistic warfare was basically starting to move the first steps rightly just beyond that. I also never make ever the mistake of presuming that Macedonian warfare, Alexandrian warfare Hellenistic warfare stemmed from a simple sort of development/evolution of classical Hellenic warfare. It has nothing to do with that, right? It's not because, again, there were sort of just longer spears and more or less they looked like phalanxes that the military logic or strategic essence of the Macedonian art of war had anything to do with the classical one. It was a complete surpassing, had practically nothing to do with that. It was conceived in terms of combined arms. And it was something basically had not been developed up to the point within the Hellenic world. The Achaemenids had already something like that, and it would have not been surpassed until Cannae, right? And Annibalic warfare, after which basically nothing was added in strategical principles until today, in a sense. For telling you also how conceptual the art of war and its principles actually are, right? To presume that firearms or technological advancement have to do with how war is actually fought per se. It's just an asinine take on reality, and it's mostly made by people, again, that want to sell books because they tell you, oh, look, this is new and I found that out. Nope. Now, Aeneas Tacticus' treatise focuses on the defense of fortified cities, as we've seen, which was an important deal because the 4th century, as we have witnessed in the video about the development of the Gastrophetes and early artillery, witnessed an important acceleration in siege warfare, in sort of more robust, elaborated fortifications, and especially also siege machinery, torsion catapults, like in that case. And so there is all a space where this is taking place, without mentioning that, as we explained in the aforementioned video, the first, even though the military engineers that created those machines were largely Hellenic, the first case, like the first documented instance of torsion catapults being used in this context is a Roman one, like some Roman expansion against other Italic cities, receiving the support of this military technologists. Mostly the center was Syracuse, Sicily, and eventually it was Alexander that took this at a completely different scale. We talked about this recently. We also mentioned Demetrius Poliorcetes. It was the video, I think, on Lysimachos, or I don't remember actually which one it was, but again, we talked enough about Hellenistic warfare and ancient artillery for you to check that out, but we really have to have a very intense discussion at some point, like father and son sitting down, we have to tell us important about the actual meaning ancient and scope and capacity of and function of ancient artillery within the art of war of the time. That actually continues a bit like throughout the Middle Ages and even part of the modern era during firearms, technological era, but still. Now, Aeneas' treatise also offers practical advice on fortifications, resource management. This tells you, of course, how this man was involved in some kind of military administration as a governor or something. In some polis, of course, countering siege tactics, reflecting his first-hand knowledge of warfare in the Hellenic polis of the era. Historical sources indicate he may have been involved in liberating Sicyon from its tyrannical government. That, as you know, is a very specific thing in ancient Greece. We are in 367 BC, underscoring his military leadership role, but at large we don't know with precision, even accuracy for some reason. We're going in chronological order, by the way, which is useful in this regard. Evangelos. How many of you have actually heard of him? 3rd century BC. Evangelos was an Hellenic author referenced by Arrian and noted by Polybius as the creator of Tactica, a collection of military-themed texts that have not survived. That's why you have not heard of him. He remains a shadowy figure. By the way, I made an entire video about the meaning of Tactica from the Hellenic meaning and military terminology in the video in which I, of course, thoroughly rejected, which is also widely known, the notion that either the Etruscans or the Romans at any point of their history had anything to do with Hellenic hoplitic tactics. They didn't. There wasn't such a thing. In the Etruscan Roman world, it was just at most something that existed in the Hellenic polis of Magna Graecia, and at a small level that was not even that important in a broader military scale compared to the Romans, for example, and other peoples. Tactica means order, right? And it has to do with a general principle of aligning troops in fact, some battle lines that would remain compact, like passing from column to battle line, having this gradual use of reserves, maintaining the alignment during the advance, etc. Something that had gradually evolved from, say, the Assyrian infantry passing through Greece and ending up to the Italian peninsula at that point. And it has nothing to do with the sort of hardcore hoplitistic meme that we have, especially still reasoning a bit like the Greeks did, as if there were these tactical modules for which, by the way, people's radically different from one another. That's not what happened, and unfortunately, that chapter here, it's the 3rd century BC, so it's the moment in which Rome has fully geared in its manipular system. There are the Punic Wars going on that will reach full maturity at the time of the second. And so it's interesting to think about figures like that also at the time, this cultural context. No specific details about Evangelos' background or military experience are recorded, but his work likely covered tactical formations and strategies in pretty relatively straightforward fashion, given its title and citations by later historians. You know that we have some sort of relatively squared Hellenic information regarding a bit like the ideal, because the Greeks wrote mostly by ideals of what had to be the perfect formation, or which kind of there could have been there, etc. Some information is actually real, but we don't have to think that of this works as nothing but some sort of divertissement that was reasoned upon as some sort of strategic principle and ideas for the younger commanders to toy with, and not really being necessary even for teaching them at the end of the day how to lead armies, which would have just learned straight away from being introduced as the establishment did to warfare in those positions of command through initiations of different kinds and so on, right? Just know that these ideas are some sort of kind of broader development and evolution of, I don't know, stuff you could find, I don't know, in 8th century Pict land when next generation chieftains were educated in terms of how to set up an ambush or whatever. So it's nothing so, even from our side, shouldn't be, okay, we have a manual that tells us about how things actually were, and this author said that, so it's true, because many people think like this, like, this author said this, so it's real. Fantastic. You missed the entire point of history, that is the critical analysis of sources. And so it's even a better interpretation as far as, it's more romantic, it's more plastic, it's more accurate in many ways of a much deeper and complex reality, but also a more straightforward strategic one. As von Clausewitz says, war is hard, but it's not complex. It's really simple at the end of the day. It's really very difficult to do. And in fact, the simplest war is, the bigger, for example, armies are, and so the more tied you are in terms of strategic options, the hardest it is. All right, that's all what it gets down to. So we're over fixating with numbers, files, ranks. Yes, there are some standards we're aware of in general, and that also show us, however, that things were pretty much shared among populations at the time. And again, I'm not going to digress on this, but you know the point. Now, the lack of surviving texts and limited references suggest that Evangelos was a lesser-known figure already at the time, possibly a theorist whose contributions were overshadowed, of course, by prominent writers like Polybius. Let's talk about Pyrrhus. We are in the 3rd century BC. I made a video about Pyrrhus. It's such a monumental figure. He was deemed after Alexander the greatest commander in classical antiquity, also by men of the caliber of Antiochus the Great. Of the same Scipio, Africanus, and Hannibal that, as you know, are told, and that friendship, by the way, to have really met in Syria at Antioch at the Seleucid court and discuss about this matter. The fame of Pyrrhus is great for many reasons that we can't simply browse today because he would require further videos on him, but his background. He was born around 319 BC in the Molossian royal family. He was the king of Epirus and a renowned military commander known for his campaigns against Rome and Macedon. Cited by Aelianus Tacticus, Arrian, and in a letter by Cicero as the author of a series of military writings known as Tactica, yet another one, he drew on his extensive battlefield experience, including victories at Heracleon, 280 BC, and Asculum, 279 against the Romans. The latter was a famous Pyrrhic victory in the sense of, like, if we have another battle like this, we're done for, even though we won. We suffered too many losses. I partly talked about this in the video about the comparison between the Macedonian phalanx and Manipular legion. As such a great commander that basically wanted to conquer the Western Mediterranean as a launching pad for recreating Alexander's empire and reaching up to India, Pyrrhus' work would unavoidably be more important and famous, and in fact known to all these other famous authors of antiquity. Right? We can't simply talk about Pyrrhus tactics. I studied the aforementioned battles from primary sources, from scholarship, and very often Pyrrhus is attributed things that people don't know are just at some point mentioned by an author here and there. And if you're not familiar with how historiography works, given that in antiquity, again, we have such few authors, after all, we tend, at least historiography tends to not necessarily over-rely on them, but let's say mentioning them as a sort of anecdotal sort of proof of erudition of some sort, but some are pretty rigged. Like, it's those things like, Hannibal knew how to gain victory but not to exploit it with marble, said because somebody else said after Cannae that Hannibal could simply march on Rome. And no, he couldn't, right? We know that, like from strategic analysis of post-Cannae, right? But it's like of those anecdotes that people still repeat because, again, they have no absolute idea of the context of why was that. The fact that there are studies that explain why that was not the case. But even at the time, there were some authors that were sort of more straightforward than others that were just copying them at some point. This happens in antiquity. Right, we've seen it, for example, the other day in the video about the Battle of Pharsalus, how some sources basically just copy one another. Some want to make a bit more dramatic characterization of the author, especially as antiquity fades. Instead, for this earlier centuries before Christ, this is such a hard and concrete awareness of this guy's achievements that did not overly fantasize on their actual capacities. For example, the notion that, Pyrrhus invented some more flexible system for the Macedonian phalanx, because look at Asculum, he used some Oscan mercenaries interspersed in the battle line as heavy infantry together with the phalangites, and so... Like, first of all, he was not the only one to do that, but first, how do you think eventually that works? That it's the phalanx is more flexible? How? Is the battle line, going, moving as an harmonica back and compressing, re-expanding? How do you imagine that a battle formation actually works? I mean, there is not this huge difference between any, Italic or Macedonian formation. It's heavy infantry to work the same, and there's no sort of mechanistic explanation of who wins or who loses and how and why. And we're not told, even by the source, that there was any kind of flexibility. Again, whatever that actually means, in people's heads, they throw, out this term, flex. It was more flexible. So, what does that actually mean when you have single infantry battle lines that have to clash against one another, and most with sort of gradual release of reserves in different? Nobody really knows. But again, how many people have actually studied every battle of that kind from primary sources, realizing when, for example, another source may be saying something inaccurate, because it's also the point that some of these men did not really have, some of these authors, of course, but I'm not talking Pyrrhus in this case, whose tactic, unfortunately, we have lost, as we were saying before. But there were some authors that literally did not have this great military experience, as some people believe. For example, big shocker, Polybius' military experience does not seem to have been particularly relevant, especially in terms of Macedonian phalanx versus manipular legion, because he likely neither even saw a battle between the two, nor he was this military genius or person with enormous military expertise, like as we'll see now. There were some military offices that he covered, but in some ways this was just part of the normal business and establishment of aristocracy in the broader Hellenistic world. And also in that case, we have a very scarce evidence of any further, characteristic capacity that people like, however, to fantasize upon. If we hand Pyrrhus Tactica, we'll probably remain amazed by how, even though talking about strategy and tactics, he would have probably not gone too far from the all this Tactica canon that, as we've seen, had already been established. It's not like by reading Pyrrhus Tactica you would necessarily find tales about his campaigns emphasizing combined arms, the use of war elephant, whatever. It would have been some sort of more ideal concept, and yes, he would have thought of his experience, but not in ways that we read by, for example, other historians that were not in Pyrrhus' mind for that matter. In any case, we know that Pyrrhus' work influenced Hellenistic and Roman military thought. Besides, the authors that were aware of his work do not necessarily say, oh my god, that Tactica was a masterpiece, guys, you must read that, he's had this and that. They did not reason like that, because it was normal, again, for manuals at the time not to be actually positive, applicable instructions of how to concretely fight a battle, right? This is not the phase in history you have to arrive to the 18th century, to the 19th, to have a military manual that at most can integrate with practical even just not even practical, but theoretical insight, certain aspects of the art of war that you will eventually have to step on, however, through your direct command. Like if there are military treatises in antiquity, in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, I made multiple videos about, for example, the Dutch school, etc., during the 16th and the 17th century. They absolutely have barely anything to do with how war was actually waged in especially expandably applicable terms. All right, and it was mostly just a general proof and insight of the author's world vision, especially by people sharing the blood with Alexander the Great, like Pyrrhus did, in a metaphysically traditional sense, not much, okay, here's how you have to put the elephants in battle. Like it doesn't really work like that. There's no doubt, however, that again, Pyrrhus' work and considering his experience, his military curriculum would shape later military strategies, and also the same tactica literary canon. Marcus Porcius Cato, again, as I was saying before, I made a video about him. The most Roman guide, that ever lived, 234-149 BC. This guy wrote a lot, not just about warfare. He was a Roman statesman and soldier born in Tusculum, so it's pretty much near Rome, but it already came from, you understand, this plebeian gentis with the name of, in this case, of pigs, of hogs, for example. And he, however, these were men with massive attributes in spite of that. We talk about how patricians were integrated in the Roman, plebeians were integrated in the Roman establishment just a couple of centuries before. He participated in the Second Punic War, including the Battle of Metaurus in 207 BC, and that was a hell of a battle, right? Nero goes in parallel with Scipio in terms of actual capacity to perform outflanking maneuver. Again, very novel to Roman warfare that absolutely had not developed manipular tactics for any greater sake of maneuverability. That's just something that the Roman army came to by tactical maturity, and not because somebody woke up in the morning and said, let's use maniples to outflank the enemy. That's not how it happened for a good century. At Metaurus, he served as a military tribune. He later served as governor of Spain and Cancer in 184. As we know, he also participated to the Battle of the Thermopylae against the Seleucids. He actually led the outflanking party that basically freaked out the Seleucid force and allowed, with the Thermopylae, it's always the same old story, like finding the path to outflank the enemy. And the Seleucid phalanx sort of collapsed instantly as soon as they saw him, waving his sword, spurring the legionnaires. He wrote several works on military matters, possibly the first composed directly in Latin. This is, again, object of debate. We should get a bit more in depth in Latin literature to explain how and why, especially how Romans would see such genre as Romans, because to them, and as you know, Cato was pretty stern in many ways, but the Romans up to that point believed that anyone dedicating himself to the letters in a sort of thorough sense would be some sort of effeminated person. Cato is just a great conservative writer. He praises the Roman autumn, the administration of the latifundia, and so on. So he was a fully rounded Roman that began to that actually hated Hellenism, but accepted it as subordinated to Romanity, and so also emanated this works that were somehow in line with the new horizons of the Roman world. Only indirect references to these works of Cato remain, including the military ones, including mentions of a section on res militaris in text dedicated to his son Marcus, namesake. His military writings likely drew on his experience in Roman campaigns covering topics such as discipline, logistics, and camp organization, reflecting his role in Roman administration and battlefield leadership. Then Polybius. I could talk 47 hours in a row about Polybius, but let's not overdo. 208-126 BC, critical years in Roman history. And also in the Hellenic one as well, as the Romans take over Greece at this point. Polybius was notorious, his life is notorious. He was born into an aristocratic Hellenic family in Megalopolis, Arcadia. He was the son of Leucortas, a prominent Achaean League strategist. So again, this was the establishment of the Achaean League. At that point, it was essentially the greatest power in Hellas, as essentially escaping Macedonian vassalage, and having important connections with, for example, Egypt, the Ptolemies, and so on. Polybius pursued a political career within the anti-Roman faction of the Achaean League, by the way, and because when war broke out between Macedon and Rome, of course, the Achaeans had to determine what side they would choose, and eventually, at least initially, they sided with Rome. Eventually, Rome would take even Corinth over, and so again, that's history that, and Polybius lived right through that. In his mentions in his career, Polybius at some point held the office of hipparch, that, as you know, is the cavalry commander, indicating military experience of some sort before his deportation to Rome as a hostage, alongside 1,000 other notable figures following the defeat at Pydna in 168 BC, in the ensuing sort of hegemonization of Greece from the side of Rome that began to lord over it. Now, being deported to Rome as a hostage, think about this. And of course, this is not like, again, guy in chain as a slave. No, these were noble-blooded people who were considered as some higher genus, and the Romans cared very much about these individuals to, of course, cope them and establish some greater control on Hellas. Hosted by the consul Aemilius Paulus, he became a mentor. This was the victor of the Macedons, and became a mentor and a friend to Paulus' son, Scipio Aemilianus, and joined the influential Scipionic circle, establishing himself as a leading intellectual of his time, thanks to such enormous patronage. Naturally, the Scipionic circle was replete with overwhelmingly traditional virility and Roman legendary sagas of victory, of accomplishment, given the Roman triumphs of the previous generations against the Carthaginians, against the Hellenistic powers. And so at this point, Polybius really learned so much. He would have also learned on his own, but he, at this point, having aligned with Rome's cause, developed a deep interest in her history as well, a history that he further witnessed from the Roman side firsthand as it was happening. He was alongside Scipio Aemilianus during the fall of Carthage in 146 BC, which was a veritable massacre. These were the years in which also Corinth was razed to the ground. I made a video about this because Rome was really at this point, on the defensive and needed to make a bit of an example, just exterminating some of these centers just out of, sheer will to power. Especially Carthage, everybody said, oh my God, Carthage was razed to the ground. It was not so important after all. Corinth was important because Corinth represented, again, one of the great capitals of Hellenism in a broader sense, and that showed that Romans were not just to be all nice with the Greeks simply walking in Alexandrian fashion. Like if they woke up on the wrong side of the bed, they could simply exterminate everyone. Polybius also witnessed to the capture of Numantia in Celtiberia in 133 BC. That was yet another feat. We talked about Celtiberian warfare a little bit. And so he had a hell of an experience all across the Mediterranean. Polybius' principal work, Historiae, the histories, chronicles Hellenic, Oriental, and Roman history in a concise and practical style, spanning from the onset of the First Punic War, 264 BC to 144 BC, and the start is beautiful. Like, we're so foolish not to want to know how Rome came to this enormous amount of power. And he, again, his work is enormous. It's beyond offering significant military and historical insights. It's just really restoring to the modern mind a vision of the universe in those times, passing through the metaphysical centrality of Rome and her empire. It's beyond words. And again, Polybius is an incredible source, blending that Hellenic theory, care for rational responses, technology, etc., but with Roman practicality, sense of moral grandeur. And beyond that, the Greeks had come to recognize, if anything, for having been defeated fair and square by the Romans. And so Polybius himself was fascinated with Rome, naturally in a deep sense, regardless of, again, whatever he had to write in the condition in which he found himself, but that he also somehow chose to further exploit. This work is unpresentable, really, especially in this such a poor fashion. However, it's a story, in fact, but it talks about indirectly, obviously, about Roman military organization, tactics, discipline. It's enriched by his observations and possible participation in campaigns, obviously enough, but not really the ones that were mostly told. I mean, if you read, for example, the famous paragraph, the famous chapter actually after the Battle of Pydna, where he rationalizes essentially why Rome had defeated the Macedonian phalanx, which was believed to be the perfect instrument of Hellenic military genius. He gives this rationalizing answer that is almost naive in the mechanical technicality, and that reveals to you, obviously enough, that he had not really ever seen a battle between a legion and a phalanx, and that, if anything, he was trying to make sense of a defeat that obviously had struck him deeply himself. It had brought him to the Roman shores themselves, and that, in a sense, he wanted to write mostly for the Greeks and the Hellenic way of thinking. Then, for however the Romans would have thought that would have been instead much more accurate. And it's literally, like, if we didn't have Polybius, we wouldn't know practically anything about the Middle Republic and Roman army. That in fact is called Polybian for this reason. And that, in fact, it's not even a type of, there was never a Polybian reform as people may think. There is the so-called legion that developed as essentially the fully manipular one at the end of the Samnitic Wars, at the end of the 4th century BC. And then there's the Polybian phase, because he starts, as we've seen, talking about essentially from the first half of the 3rd century BC, and then witnessing to its full maturity in the age of Scipio Africanus, where the guy was born, right, in a time which basically those professional standards of the Roman legion that sometimes we project just on the Marian reform had already been set, and would have just had to be regularized later by reforms and the expansion of Rome also as a more of an occupation force, because before the 1st century BC, Rome just essentially controlled the Mediterranean coastline. It was enough, right? It's rather later that they needed something more professionally comprehensive and organizationally permanent to really reach the fullest in terms of a military civilization of the kind that, of course, Rome is mortal for. If anything, Flavius Josephus, that we'll see now, described that instead. But let's think about this, because it's Polybius telling the story. All right, we don't have really Romans talking about this in this century. And when we read Caesar, when we read Tacitus, we are amazed by the sheer sort of level of traditional sagas view. Even with all the Hellenic influence that existed at the time, the same goes for Livy, and again, we could make many names. But the Romans had a completely different mindset. It would be incredible just to know how, of course, the Scipio Africanus, but even the same Scipio Aemilianus later on would have described, for example, the conquest of Greece or the Punic Wars, right? The defeat over the Seleucids, etc. And so, again, unfortunately, we don't have much of this kind. But remember, we said before, also the Greeks wrote always for sort of canon. Otherwise, they would have probably acted out in very different ways. They were themselves more traditional. And again, more concrete. It's like, again, we can't digress into details, but let's say, what would happen at a centurion's level? We don't really know. Not just because a centurion never wrote a military treatise, or at least they would not arrive to us, but just because of the social cultural context in general that would not require that, as we've explained. But because really there was historiography was something relatively new, just per se, and so again, the distance of these works from actual military practice are not abyssal at all. They're actually very coherent and logical. But to the point, they're also very polished in that do not really care about some lower aspects that would have shown a much wider sort of humus of quite interesting details that, as we were saying, maybe we have for medieval warfare, but we don't have for classical antiquity, forever informing an idea that it's not much their fault for not having complemented with else, but for us to simply pretend to be just that, as if what is written is just something constitutionally different in the essences of war from, say, even just the medieval age, and not wanting to see the plenitude of these military systems. That, as incredible as they were also pretty, straightforwardly similar to the ones we see in other years. Now, Polybius, speaking of the 40 books, only the first 5 are fully preserved, along with summaries and fragments of the others. Other works by Polybius, including, which is yet another tragedy, including a dedicated treatise on military strategy, are lost, once again, highlighting his role as a bridge between Hellenic and Roman military thought. And again, it's too few for Polybius, but we also have these other names. Posidonius, 135-50 BC, other interesting moment in Roman history. He was an Hellenic philosopher and mathematician from Apamea in Syria. So he's a bit of a different background here. He was not of a military man, much of a military man himself, or he was mostly like a philosopher. He reasoned in more abstract terms. And this is completely normal in what Hellenistic Syria had become at this point, gradually tending to gravitate also on the Roman rule, but not really developing, in fact, much of a military system on its own, because the Seleucids were basically ended at this point by Pompey. And educated in Athens, however, under Panethius, he produced fragments of texts with military significance. His works likely included discussions of military logistics and geography, reflecting his broad intellectual scope as a Stoic philosopher, historian, and scientist, though no direct military experience is recorded. Likely he would have not have. Or at least this was a very violent war, of course. It's not like he would have not known, but he's of a different mold from some military commanders. His contributions were theoretical, focusing on the strategic implications of space, let's say, and influencing later military theorists somewhat. Lucius Cincius, right, is also a relatively minor source in this context. He was this was a Roman, as you understand from the name, a jurist from the Ciceronian era. so the ones of Caesar and Pompey and of Octavian, distinct from the more renowned 3rd century BC Roman annalist Quinctius Alimentus. You don't have to mix him up with him. Is noted for his now lost military treatise. Just like that. Unfortunately, we named them because we know that they had written something about it, but we lost that, unfortunately. And this is just the ones that we know we lost. Imagine the ones we don't know to have lost. At least these were secondaries. And so, overall, we have an idea of more or less what kind of military treatises would have existed out there in general, what kind of figures would have written them. We know of Quinctius because Gellius, in his Noctes Atticae 1604, references excerpts from the 3rd and 5th books of his work addressing, for example, the war declaration ceremony, oaths. See how more Roman it is, exemptions from military service, while the 6th book details the structure of the legion, which we would have really liked to hear about. The treatise likely provided a legal and organizational perspective on Roman warfare, though no evidence suggests Quinctius had direct military experience, suggesting his work was rooted in some kind of legal scholarship rather than battlefield knowledge per se. Never underestimate, however, the level of militarization of Roman society, also, especially at this point during the civil wars, where literally millions of Roman citizens were mobilized. Asclepiodotus, this is a more famous figure, 1st century BC. He was an Hellenic writer and student of the aforementioned Posidonius. Born in an unknown Hellenic polis, he authored a military manual outlining the tactics of the Macedonian phalanx, right, offering that kind of schematic number, sort of proportions, formations, array, and so on. The work describes, in fact, the formations, the movements, and training of the phalanx. Right, it's one of the most straightforward sources on the topic, and therefore also key Hellenistic military sort of insight on this system that, as you understand, by the way, was basically over by this point, because we don't really have any evidence of, even the Pontics at some point using the phalanx. It was something very characteristic of the Macedonian world, and at this point, no Hellenistic power really had the means to put together once again. Of course, Asclepiodotus reflects the tactical knowledge he inherited from the time of Alexander, of the Megas. No record confirms Asclepiodotus' military experience, indicating his work was likely theoretical, drawing on Hellenistic military traditions and philosophical training under Posidonius, that, as you understand here, was also just from the generation before. Then we have another relatively famous name, Onasander, 1st century AD. He was an Hellenic author, possibly from Asia Minor. He wrote the Strategicon. This is the Hellenic title. Then there was the Latin one that it's sort of interesting to see how, again, in terms of the difference between the Hellenic and the Latin mindset, in Latin it was De Optimo Imperatore. So it basically, for a Greek, this was talking about strategy in general. And so as far as the soldier, because stratos, as you know, it means soldier. And for the Romans, instead, it was about the optimal emperor, he who wielded the imperium. So, in a strictly commanding sense, that, as Schwerpunkt followers know, it's something also very theologically precise in religious terms for everybody involved, but by the way, not just for the Romans. But it's interesting how, in fact, the Romans would mostly see the more traditional meaning, as opposed to the Greeks that had somehow a bit mythologized the world in a way, had a bit more. I don't know how to say that, but they sort of were ironic, even in terms towards power in many ways. In any case, this work is a treatise exploring the responsibilities and qualities of an ideal military commander. All right. So the work emphasizes leadership, morale, strategic decision-making aimed at guiding generals in both war and governance. Remember, 1st century AD. So most of these authors now are people really coming from some aristocratic background that allowed them for writing these works and being read, especially within the sort of more in this higher level elite establishment of the Hellenistic world that was more intellectual in general. But in a reality where Rome had taken over everything, and so the Greeks, as you know, reasoned as if they lived in this unspoiled bubble where they were still free, and Rome was just an accident along the way, while in fact the Roman Empire was consolidating, was sort of territorializing, was really taking over, in fact, and demilitarizing, pacifying, and the various peoples. And so here there are no Hellenistic kingdoms, empires, where to draw military experience from, as even, I don't know, Polybius in the Achaean League could. No evidence indicates, in fact, that Onasander had personal military experience at this point, suggesting his work was also theoretical, drawing on earlier Hellenic military traditions and philosophical insight, possibly, of course, influenced by his regional background in Asia Minor. That was a very, especially in the West, radically advanced reality since Hellenistic times. Still at this point, with Rome, I have prepared a video about resuming a series about the Roman provinces in Asia Minor. Roman Asia is the next. Then we have Aurelius Cornelius Celsus, 1st century AD. He was a Roman encyclopedist, likely from a patrician family, who wrote an encyclopedic work encompassing 6 disciplines: agriculture, medicine, military strategy, oratory, philosophy, and jurisprudence. Again, we are more in that Hellenistic encyclopedical mindset that somehow it was thought to be a bit like in a great Gothic sort of universal context, like let's order the world according to this knowledge that we can found, etc. Besides of all this encyclopedia, only the De Medicina, so the medicine part, remains extant. Celsus' military section likely covered theoretical aspects of warfare, but no record exists of Celsus having military experience. At least it's possible that he had. But again, we don't have to think these texts were ever more sort of particularly into that side of their sort of realistic first-hand explicit description of warfare, things like that. It was just not in the mindset of the time. And we see here mostly like a scholarly contribution aiming at broadening the intellectual audience rather than spreading any practical military application. That again, it's not like the Roman military really needed this moment, or in others for that matter. Then we have Josephus Flavius, the Latin way Flavius Josephus, 37-100 AD. He is super famous. We, of course, mentioned him in our videos about the Roman and the first Jewish revolt against Rome. Josephus was born Joseph ben Mattathiau in Jerusalem to priestly Pharisee family opposing extremistic factions and commanding forces during the Jewish revolt in Galilee against Rome in 66 AD, notably defending Jotapat until his surrender in 67 AD. After surrendering to Vespasian, with whom he formed a friendship and adopted the Roman name Josephus Flavius, he settled in Rome, where he wrote historical and apologetic works defending his pro-Roman stance. So again, yet another case of, Rome co-op to, you fought against Rome initially, but again, and it's understandable, if you look at the general background, how and why. First of all, you would fight for a rebellion of your own nation, but then when you're defeated, if you're of a higher rank, you're not, basically, you have asked also for the Roman pardon and entering this broader context of resistance, but also again of were subjugation and Roman acceptance, let's say, of the recognition of her power. The Romans were mostly merciless with those who, after having subjected themselves to Rome, would rise in rebellion. Otherwise, they were open towards those who had at least chosen to fight, but then, gave up at some point. After surrendering to Vespasian, with whom Josephus formed a friendship and adopted the Roman name Josephus Flavius, he settled in Rome, where he wrote historical and apologetic works defending, as we've seen, his pro-Romans. Josephus has a very beautiful way of describing the Roman army. There are some concepts properly like the eagle, like being a Norman against, a Norman that shall conquer everything against whom they march, witnessing this this imperium walking a bit like, Hegel watching Napoleon walking in his city, like the spirit of the universe, of God himself passing through these forces. Things like, for the Romans, military training is just, warfare is actually just like military training, but spilling a bit of blood in it. So he nails much of the grandeur of the Roman army at this point. That is really something to behold. Josephus' most famous work is indeed the Jewish War, where this info stems from, consisting of 7 books and providing detailed accounts of Roman military life, including sieges, troop deployments, logistics, enriched by his direct experience as a commander and the perspective of foreign observer, in a sense, offering thus unique insights into Roman warfare from a Jewish perspective. Then we have Sextus Julius Frontinus, 30-103 AD. He was a Roman senator born in Gaul, serving as governor of Britannia from 74 to 78, proconsul of Asia as well, and holding prominent civil and military roles under Domitian and Nerva. If you're interested in Domitian's reign, I made some videos about him. His military experience included commanding legions in Britannia, where he subdued the Silures in southern Wales, demonstrating his strategic acumen. He wrote works on land surveying and hydraulics, including the notable De Aquis Urbis Romae, in 2 books composed while overseeing Rome's aqueducts. You get here the best of Roman governors involved in both civil and military affairs, expert in engineering, in warfare, and so everything that blended well together as far as imperial control was concerned. Frontinus also famously authored the Stratagemata, a 4-book compilation of military tactics written between 83 and 96, which collects examples of stratagems from Hellenic and Roman history to illustrate clever battlefield solutions, and a general treatise on military strategy, De Re Militari, which is now lost, reflecting his dual role as administrator and military theorist, but also between sort of a Hellenic and Roman-minded individual. This is relevant because we're entering that phase where military treatises are starting literally to leave a bit of the myth of classical antiquity, paradoxically. This is where sort of the parable is reaching its maximum in a sense, and or at least that necessity to mostly talk about a reality that had already been set by Rome, and the Hellenic world was just to be repeated rather than sort of expanded per se. It's also the mentality of a preserving empire. All right, we will talk more next about the Roman campaigns in Britain that are quite relevant as far as also Frontinus' life is concerned. Then we have Apollodorus of Damascus, better known as, at least in his language, as Apollodorus tes Damascu, 60-125 AD. This is a great figure, right? The greatest architect in Imperial Rome, of course, of Hellenistic background, you see here, a Syrian architect, in particular born in Damascus, serving under Trajan and Hadrian. designing the famous Danube Bridge during the Dacian Wars, the Pantheon that you can still admire. Of course, there were lots of people behind all these works, but still, Apollodorus represented this Levantine element of mixed Cyrillianic, background, genius, and capacity. Syria was quite advanced historically. Also, Trajan's Forum in Rome was supervised by him in construction. He wrote Polyorketica, a treatise on sieges and war machines, which is quite obvious considering his also military engineering understanding. As you understand, these people were versed a bit in all kind of engineering. Also, the Romans were very engineering-minded in a sense, and given their practical, squared background. And they were a bit like the geniuses of antiquity, a bit like, a Leonardo would know a bit of everything in the Renaissance. This was such a great moment, the peak of imperial power. The Polyorketica details the construction and use of siege engines and fortifications. No evidence suggests that Apollodorus was a proper military man, even though he actually participated to military campaigns or facilitated the logistics of the Roman army through this massive infrastructures. Obviously, his work reflects deep technical knowledge applied to military engineering, possibly influenced by his architectural expertise in Roman imperial projects that, however, would have been all one at some point. To think about Roman colonization, fortification, conquest, and so on. They all went in parallel with one another, roads, aqueducts. Then we have Flavius Arrianus, 2nd century AD. He was born in Nicomedia, Bithynia, a student of Epictetus and a close friend of Emperor Hadrian. This is very Hellenistic context, of course. Hadrian, as you know, cared very much about the Hellenistic East. He reinforced very much also the frontier there. And he was an Hellenist in tastes in many ways. Arrian held significant roles, including proconsul of Baetica, consul in 130, and governor of Cappadocia from 131 to 136, where he successfully, as famously, repelled an Alan invasion. We are in 135, demonstrating his military competence. Now, you know what his work is. Even if people have never read it, the Ectaxis Cata Alanon, or also known in the Latin Acius contra Alanus, his most wonderful piece of work documenting, in fact, the rather convoluted sort of array that he would have used which is a real instruction, like to his subordinates in the East during the invasion to deploy against the Alans. Now, much has been written about this. We also read it if I'm not wrong, in my video about the late Republican and early Imperial battle array. It's somehow a controversial piece because the Alans also made multiple videos about them. They were a steppe people, essentially, in the Iranian one. Some framed them within the Sarmatians. Some think they were a bit different. They came from the Tiang Shang. They were, again, some of the fiercest knights the fiercest knights in the history of mankind. There is no doubt. They went on for millennia after this, during the migration era, the time of the Mongols, where the Roman emperors used Alans in their bodyguards as much as like the Chinese one at some point. They were everywhere, and we will make other videos about them. Naturally, I also made a video especially about from the Eurasian Steppes series, describing, in fact, the encounter between, say, the Romans, the Bosphorans, and the Sarmatians in a broader sense. And I described my perplexities regarding the Ectaxis Cata Alanon, if anything, seeing it through an Hellenistic, positivistic lens, a bit like the one we described for Polybius. Polybius was very famous also in the 19th century during the proper age of positivism, exactly because of his straightforward, this is how things went, like, again, the explanation of how the Romans defeated the Macedons in a technically tactical way. So the Ectaxis Catalanon seems very much along similar patterns, meaning, okay, we will deploy the army in this way. And as we've seen, it's incredibly complicated, right? Or at least it's complicated because we don't even have the specifics of how this formation would have actually looked like. In actual fact, it's more like mixed instruction, yes, military theory. It's something even approaching tendentially the strategicon of Mauritius, like the idea that there is a tactical module and that if you use this, it's going to be. And it's very Roman in the sense, at least in the measure in which it describes all the various units, the various legionnaires, the various auxiliaries that have to be distributed in a different way, and he calls like specific commanders by name and so on. How this system would have actually coped against the Alans, whose also array, of course, is not as equally described by any source, unfortunately. But it's, again, probably a very theoretical thing, or at least something that would have worked in ways that those soldiers knew that we don't. But everybody has the opinion of how this would have worked. Again, before making this video, I haven't made the premise to the premise regarding how actually few we know about the Roman military. Regardless of the fact, of course, that left all these kind of sources as the universal empire in Western Eurasia and so on, but still the details are normally not known, as they're normally not known in China or anywhere. Actually, these are the places in the world where we get the most in-depth, insightful evidence, because still the Greeks more or less invented at least our Western history, historiography, and just in many ways the Indo-European legacy is very powerful in the confidence, especially of being able to explain the world. And these are things that in turn are not explained to you in school. They just present you this, there was the West Indies, and more or less the same thing. No, right? But again, never commit the mistake of presuming that we know everything about this. Paradoxically, we know more about the Roman army from Polybius than we know from any other early imperial source that, as we've explained here, was already or a bit less interested or involved. This is also specifically important into actual military operations at a big level against any major empire. I don't know. It's again, as we've seen, there are governors that, like in this case, also that have military mansions, but they do not quite need to describe here an apocalyptic clash or something that invested the full Roman military per se. The Romans knew how to make war. There was hardly any treatise that had to explain to them how to actually do that. So this Ectaxis Catalanon is mostly like a general take on something that had happened regarding this. One of the different raids that the Alans carried out historically, like the Iranians through Asia Minor, whoever was there at any time. This was the Roman one. Anyways. In 136, Arrian wrote, and we didn't read, I confused with Appian before the source. We will talk about him later. Arrian is naturally another guy. He wrote the Aeneas Tacticus, which also from the title speaks volumes about the mentality of this guy already towards an Hellenistic direction of the technicality of the order and everything. He was a bit toward that direction. A treatise divided into two sections, one on Hellenic and Macedonian tactics focusing on phalanx and cavalry maneuvers, the other on Roman tactical innovations introduced by Hadrian, by the way, such as improved discipline and training methods reflecting his Arrian's administrative and military leadership roles. You see what this is. I mean, it's the great Hellenic tradition in this essentially Hellenistic East, but within a Roman Empire that's still recognized, at least in these higher figures like Hadrian, who was benefactor of the same Arrian. Like, okay, this great leader, commander of the whole cosmic empire still introduced this or that change, but there is a perfect Hellenic world that was already setting the premises to all of this. I made a video about, by the way, Roman Bithynia, if you're interested, Bithynia and Pontus. So we will also come back to that at some point. I will make a playlist, also grouping different types, say the Eastern Roman provinces or something like that. Then we have Aelianus Tacticus, where in the 2nd century AD, this guy was an Hellenic writer living in Rome, occasionally confused with Claudius Aelianus. He's believed to have authored the Tactica Theoria, the Latin name being De Instruendis Acibus, which is fascinating because it gets slightly closer to the Hellenic definition, so properly how to instruct the battle lines. The Greeks were more conceptually, say, abstract, like the theory of essentially military order, right? But they're a bit the same thing. You see, the Latin mentality reasoned by, there's literally a guy who has to come and instruct that, right? Even through a theory manner. It's a completely different worldview. I can't stress that enough. And then for Tolkien, for those who say, oh, no, the Byzantines were Romans, my eyes, right? The Roman Empire was radically different within itself in a cultural sense. It's all a different thing. This work by Aelianus was dedicated to Hadrian or Trajan, where around 106 AD. The manual examines the tactics and strategies of Alexander the Great's successors, emphasizing phalanx training and maneuvers, including detailed formations and drills. The author states he consulted the best sources, interestingly enough, including Polybius' lost military treatise, which we can assure it would have happened also because at that time all those treatises were very easily found, especially in this broader, again, great internationally Hellenizing Roman Empire. So it's really important. Though deemed less comprehensive than Arrian's work, Aelianus's profoundly influenced Byzantine and Arab military texts, as well as Renaissance military theory, notably impacting, and we talk about this for the Nassau's school, English, Swiss, and Dutch pikeman techniques, right? Because later on, like this stuff was ideally copied, like looking at the phalanx, and naturally Renaissance pike and especially shot warfare were something very different from the role of the phalanx. In later medieval and early modern history, we will also have to talk about this because you find people across the internet still thinking, I don't know, that the Swiss Reisläufer fought essentially how the Macedonian Pizzatairoi did, and that's not actually the thing. Again, because people fixate with weapons, and that's dumb, right, to do. No record confirms Aelianus's military experience, suggesting a scholarly approach to military theory, possibly drawing on his residence in Rome and access to imperial libraries. Paradoxically enough, the Romans in the West accessed libraries much more than the Greeks in the East, because the Hellenistic world was ruled by the Greeks as some sort of master race also in the East, and it was incredibly oligarchic. The Macedonians had set a monarchic feudal system of some sort. The Romans in the West had some, regardless of the fact they were also very oligarchic and nobiliarly biased, but they had a more egalitarian system. And paradoxically, like manuscripts were much more read openly into libraries than two crowds, by the way, that went there on purpose for that in the great imperial libraries in the Fora, etc. While the great big Hellenistic libraries, including the ones of Alexandria, etc., were huge depots, essentially. Like some court scholar accessed them every once in a while. He read just a part of that. They weren't open to the public. It wasn't this flourishing kind of, I don't know, people in the East were so much more literate and advanced. It's not really how that world was. Then we have Polyaenus, 150 AD, roughly. Polyaenus was a Macedonian writer, likely from Bithynia or Macedon itself. He composed the Stratagemata in 162 AD. You understand also how the titles are similar because they are part of a broader canon of military theory, dating back to quite back before. This work was dedicated to emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. At the time were cooperating, especially during their impending Parthian campaign. The work is a compilation of military anecdotes and episodes drawn from sources that are now lost, as we were saying in the beginning, covering stratagems from Hellenic, Macedonian, and Persian history, interestingly enough, if anything, because, again, the Romans here were fighting against Persia, to provide practical examples for commanders. No evidence indicates Polyaenus had military experience, suggesting his work was a scholarly compilation, possibly influenced by his rhetorical training and legal career in Rome. Then we have Appianus Alexandrius, 95-165 AD. This guy was an Egyptian-born lawyer and historian from Alexandria, who lived in Rome during the reigns of Trajan, Hadrian, and Antoninus Pius. He wrote a Roman history in 24 books that, again, we have read. Of course, he was a Greek, essentially, like we say Egyptian, because, of course, he was from Egypt, but still. We don't know too much about, of course, his background, but in general, like, that was the trend. Because, again, just mostly was the Greeks who were the educated establishment, and yeah, there would have been marriages, etc. This happened even at the royal level. For example, people say, but Cleopatra was actually Macedonian Greek. Why? They had actually married into kind of African blood. If you look at their ancestry of the various dynastic intertwinements of different reigns and whatever. But again, that doesn't mean much either. Of course, Cleopatra was not black, of course. But in the bigger picture, of course, you find, in fact, a Macedonian establishment from the age of Alexander. And we've read Appian, as I was saying before. Forgive me for having confused Arrian with Appian. Wrong consonant. This 24 books, Roman history, comprise historical monographs from Rome's origin to Trajan's death. Only 10 books, including 5 on the civil wars that we were reading the other day, in fact, survive intact along with fragments of the others. The work includes descriptions of military campaigns, though Appianus is not recorded as having direct military experience, suggesting his account were based on historical records and interviews reflecting legal and historical expertise. Then we have, I don't know if you know this guy, Taruttienus Paternus, a Roman general and praetorian prefect under Marcus Aurelius and Commodus. So we are in the second half of the end of the second century. He wrote a now lost work on military law referenced by Vegetius later on. His military experience included commanding Roman forces, like in the Marcomannic Wars, likely at least we think, and his treatise probably addressed legal aspects of military discipline and administration, reflecting his role in Roman military governance during a period of frontier warfare. Aelianus Menander, famous name as well, he was a senior official under Septimius Severus. So we're roughly around 215 AD. He authored the Quatuor Libri, the Re Militari, the 4 books on military matters, a collection of military edicts, laws, and regulations. No specific military experience also in this context is concerned. He may have had a bureaucratic role in Severian administration, emphasizing legal standardization of some sort. This is still a largely functional, yet a bit stagnant and morally decadent empire just before the 3rd century crisis that would happen in a few decades. Then we have Julius Paulus, Praetorian prefect under Emperor Alexander Severus, early 3rd century AD. He produced over 300 books, right? A Praetorian prefect back in the day was about, wearing a sword and looking cool and killing emperors or whoever they wanted to be killed. and having a massive military experience. Of course, in this sense, there is something of this kind still, but I mean, these Praetorian figures become also authors, reflecting that tendentially oligarchic and already almost Byzantine kind of more elite co-opting system where everything was ever more within the court. This guy wrote among his 300 books the Poenis Militum on military law. So literally the penalties of the soldiers. We can start saying the Poenis Militum because we are in the 3rd century. The Latin is beginning to vernacularize toward that softer direction. In any case, also in this case, we don't have an explicit evidence of military background. Of course, he had to a degree. Warfare, military administration are a bit all one, and men of this level of power had to know about that as well. Then we have Irenaeus Modestinus, an Hellenic origin jurist and advisor to Alexander Severus, active from 226 to 244, born possibly in Asia Minor, serving as prefect of the Vigiles, so essentially the local police and city militia. He wrote works such as the 19-book Responsa, the 12-book Pandecte, the 10-book Regula, and 9-book Differentiae, as well as treatises in Hellenic. Many of his military-related writings focusing on legal aspects of military organization were incorporated into Justinian's Digest in the 6th century. No military experience explicitly documented. Again, he probably was an administrator. He may have had, of course, an important role in Roman governance, as we've seen also for maintaining control. Also, sort of against unrest and, policing, whatever. Then we have Modestus, 200-300 AD. We don't know exactly the more precise dates. He was the author of the Libellus de Vocalibus Rei Militaris, so a brief vocabulary of terms used in was essentially conceived as phalanx maneuvers and training, dedicated to the Emperor Tacitus Augustus. We are in the 3rd century crisis, right? And it has, again, this interesting, almost antiquarian and definitional side of the story, and providing definitions, in fact, for technical military terms like aimed at standardizing training practice whatsoever. Again, we know very few about this guy's background as well. You see here with the 3rd century crisis, we're approaching really something else. Like here, in fact, we will have just Ammianus and Vegetius as, of course, there were other scholars, as I say, other authors, as I specified at the beginning. At some point we will make also something a bit more complete about the war, but there's a different mindset, all right? And we will try to understand now through Ammianus and Vegetius how. Ammianus Marcellinus, roughly 330-400 AD, so we are after the 3rd century crisis, after Diocletian, after Constantine. It's a very different world, all right? We arrive to almost the Federati crisis in timeline. He is the foremost Roman historian of the 4th century AD. He was born in Antioch to a Greek-speaking family. Though little is known of his personal life, was a career soldier serving as a protector domesticus. So this was actually an elite guard under emperors from Constantius II to Julian, whom he greatly admired and participated in campaigns, including Julian's Persian expedition, 363, and made videos both about the protectores, so you could say what kind of men these were. At the time, last year, was the only one to have ever made a video about that on YouTube. I also made a video about Julian's Persian expedition, even though more from a sort of broader historical point of view, not much for the military side of the story that we partly addressed. So this is the full moment of the Constantinian army system, basically, reform. I made multiple videos on late Roman warfare. We'll come back on that. Ammianus is such an important source. In fact, we used him in a video about the Battle of Argenturatum. I don't know if we'll have to re-upload that. It was an old one. I haven't updated the pictures for the sake of, again, the copyright. Never anyone ever claimed anything from the pictures, but back in the day, Schwerpunkt had to blur all the videos at some point and re-uploading a great deal of them because I began to be paranoid regarding the possibility anybody could say anything, and I began to use just properly cited, commercially usable pictures here. Ammianus famously wrote the Res Geste, a 31-book history of the Roman Empire from Nerva's death, 96 AD, to the Battle of Adrianople, 378. Very interesting choice, by the way, as a later Roman perspective, because also Nerva's reign was not, well, it opened to Trajan's, of course, reign, but in this sense, it's a completely different perspective from the guys that we began even up to the same first century AD to write about. Only 18 books covering 353 to 378 survive, right? We're at, again, the Battle of Argenturatum. It's a very pleasant read. Ammianus writes really well, and he tells us something very interesting about the whole sort of also fighting techniques we have seen for the Alemanni against the Roman legionaries. There are some interesting insights regarding potential sort of kicks, techniques, or all stuff. Protector would have known better. Known for his narrative vigor and military expertise, Ammianus' work reflects his direct experience detailing battles, logistics, and military organization with fair precision, offering a first-hand account of late Roman military affairs. Yes, there is some general, narrative accommodation, but his writings, if you understand just from the title, Res Geste is a very traditional concept, right? And I don't remember when we made a video about explaining even the etymology of gestae. And so it's more like a saga, exemplifying the military deeds also of Julian and other emperors. And it's very interesting because it's a bit in the eye of that later sort of imperial testing sort of ground that hell of a military machine underwent against enemies like the Sasanians, the Alemanni, that were really the toughest the Romans at this point in a broader sense had ever met, as far as their imperial cohesion was stressed. Finally, we have the even more famous Flavius Renatus Vegetius. Also about this guy we could talk forever. Also, Ammianus here received some poor coverage in general, but Vegetius was a senior official in the Roman administration of the late 4th to early 5th century. Possibly born in Spain or Gaul, he authored the Epitoma Rei Militaris, also known as the Re Militari, a 4-book treatise on the art of war compiled at the request of an emperor, possibly Theodosius or Valentinian II. They have something coming up in the Theodosian reign as well, to address a lack of documentation on the subject. So, first of all, consider the period, which is already very Byzantine influence. The guy, you immediately understand from his writing that this guy is a Romance, right? He's a Westerner. He has a more Latin worldview of the story. So much so that he, as you know, has the purpose in his work to basically look back at the past, say the days of glory of Caesar, of the early empire, and before, that he would have liked to see reapplied to the late Roman army. And much of the bias against the late Roman army that especially in the Constantinian case was a hell of a military machine, a more tactically performing one than at least complex and capable of adapting to different threats compared even to the early imperial Roman one, stems from Vegetius' rhetoric. Never made a video about this topic in particular, but Vegetius is so important also for medieval warfare because basically it was the only one of these treatises that was known to the medieval West to the degree it was routinely read and known, and so it absorbed a bit. Our Europe absorbed a bit this kind of rhetoric from Vegetius that also is Byzantine influence as far as that Hellenic sense of a bit greater attention towards technique to some technicalities of warfare that are a bit disconnected from a military practice. Importantly enough, for all those who cite Vegetius as a matter of truth without having even read him, Vegetius does acknowledge his lack of military experience himself. He says it out loud at the beginning, and he proceeds by offering us this kind of explicitly gathered and as often disoriented information from various historical periods, drawing on lost ancient texts, which is also interesting. His work has been defined as a late anachronistic miscellaneous synchronic exposition of institutions and phenomena spanning centuries, often with opposing functions. So Vegetius must be handled with great care. For this, he was not a clumsy author who did not know what he was doing. We must make the effort of understanding in that moment of relative crisis of the empire that basically opened almost to the sack of Rome and to many issues regarding the unity of the same empire, the sort of exhaustion of the system, the fact that society had been deflating in a sense, in its potential, and there is that crisis vibe that is sort of creeping into Roman mindset as well, and the general preponderance of the Roman East, as we were saying before, the Theodosian influence there is true also in that Byzantine mentality, even though this guy was from the West, right? So that would have to be analyzed also as far as what kind of military treatise circulated at that point, what kind of military literature existed, and how did the general sources of the time addressed the situation. This would require some sort of greater introduction and background to the topic. But Vegetius is very serious about what he's doing, because while realizing that, of course, he is admittedly trying to paint an ideal picture of the Roman army of the past, he's also revealing a lot of information about the war and dealing with pretty complete set of notions. In fact, the text in itself is very interesting to read, and there are also lots of insights on the later Roman army thing. I mean, things he heard at the time that were relative to the actual period, and that, in fact, start being more evidently known. But we really cited Vegetius many times, besides not only for late Roman history, that in the historiography on the Roman army, whenever we talk about certain, especially technicalities, maybe, I don't know, just Polybius of Vegetius told us about what was the distance between Roman legionaries. These are truly the only, in the array, in the order, these are the only two sources that, remember what I said before regarding the fact that we know practically nothing precise about the Roman army, how they are arrayed, how they fought, and so on. Even the space between legionaries that everybody thinks is the big deal, because of course it changed also during maybe from army to army, from unit to unit, depending on the circumstances and tactical adaptation. We just have Polybius and Vegetius. Polybius gives us some almost open order, and Vegetius is a pretty thickly packed one, almost a phalanx. And so, again, what do we know about the Roman army. Like Caesar tells us things like opening the maniples order, like because the legionnaires could swing the gladius better. It's not much about trying to replicate, trying to project this information on some kind of three-dimensional space to precisely calculate sizes, distances, whatever. It's about knowing the authors and, of course, considering the information in its basic technical meaning, but still understanding why would that author specifically talk about that. I mean, Caesar would make that point because, I don't know, he wanted to highlight, as we have seen also in the video about the Battle of Pharsalus, the aggressiveness of the military, how the legionnaire was still while very disciplined, to be encouraged in a individualistic sense. And it's all together with that sense of Roman saga, kind of aristocratic vision of the popularis policy of cooptation, of redemption of the lower estates for, further Roman expansion, colonization, etc. But Vegetius would give this info because he thought that, that array was sort of better, was more prudent to have a phalanx-like thick array. That is a bit our own stereotypical understanding of late Roman the late Roman army, infantry especially. Like, oh my God, now at this point they had thicker order. Do we know that? No. Right? Why do people think about that? Because we have Vegetius telling that. And because, we hear of the Fulcon, that actually also people think it was a Germanic influence. How? Exactly. Like the term, yes. But the in which way and why wouldn't, the Romans or any other people use that in the moment or in any other moment? Also, the Gauls had the testudo. It's pretty thick, but nobody says, the Romans that used the testudo, in the Republic and early imperial period were seeking for a thicker order because it was more defensive, because in the later period there were the barbarians who were pushing against them and they had to find this kind of arrays. Armies, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, had always used a different range of orders depending on the tactical situation. And a comitatensis infantryman would perfectly know how to modulate on the basis of that, given the training, the very specific training that entails such this sense of flexibility. I will use the term myself to explain, of course, how this comes as a standard pack for especially any professional soldier or even the most basically trained. So again, people want to see things in ways that are not quite there, and or that at least may even be true in a broader psychological sense, but not necessarily in a tactical one. Polybius was documenting the Romans that probably at that time were fighting in a much more, again, warrior individualistic fashion compared to the Macedonian phalanges, and so he highlighted the open order. But it's not like a Roman army of the Polybian era would always go with an open order. It doesn't make any sense. Worst of all, you find people making shorts on YouTube saying, the Romans won even when they were in numerical inferiority, even when they were numerically superior, because they had a more open order than what, say, the phalanxes had, because, Polybius said that, we are at this level of brain damage, and I don't know what we can do to some degree. But again, do people study this stuff? Not really. They don't understand that on the basis of the same sources that when they explain battles actually tell us really different things, even when they tend towards, the Polybian positivistic approach. To conclude, Vegetius is also attributed the Digestorum Artis Mulomedicinae Libri, that is to say, literally the also known as Mulomedicina, in fact, the medicine of the mules. This is a veterinary treatise highlighting his broad administrative interest. This guy would take care of it. This is absolutely fitting with the role of an administrator, people who had also to safeguard, mules are important pack animals in war, and it's not really random, right? So you can imagine these people leaving contextualized properly in the historical periods that we tend to browse in throughout our Roman history series that, again, we had at some point even the chance of discussing through the same characters at a point, and it is always very interesting to look at. This is a very interesting series. I don't know how many people will watch this type of video, but it's really necessary, because without it you can't really properly absorb the importance of the sources, and therefore you will remain without a point of reference. You will basically just rely on hearsay by simply saying, but I said that source said that, or I found this random citation on the internet because I read a guy on a forum that said that Polybius said that, so that's how the Romans actually fought. It's not just like history in general, like reality does not work like that, and so we always have to be careful with this. And again, a video on sources, I think, is so really helpful, and we can definitely expand the series a little bit. I have, again, in maybe a week or less, something about mediavistics that will take forever. Probably will make a very long, probably series of episodes of videos for the same episode, because it's all in a sense very very complex, that it's important to enter a bit this world of historiography a bit more in depth. During my studies, I had the opportunity to at some point attend some so-called historiography seminaries, which I was supposed to participate to, but it was voluntary and I refused, but I had to attend anyway for my doctoral activities. And I must say that scholarship is not really very much, historiography is not very much taught per se, at least in my background. Like what we normally missed was, in fact, an introduction to the names of the great medievalists. Then you come, at least because we were medievalists, you come to get to know them along the way, in a sense. But at the beginning, especially as a student, you don't have this great awareness of the spectrum, of the scope of these names, right? It's already a lot if they teach you history properly. But all of these people, let's say, it's as we just showed today, everything that is said is influenced by a specific context, right? It can be better or worse, by the way. It doesn't mean that since every context is differing from another, then they're all worth the same. No, there is sort of better and worse scholarship in many ways, and there is quality that you have to assess. And at that point, you really understand how important it is to be an independent historian, how important it is to have some concrete understanding of the past through the fact that at least the people who told you about this were somehow biased. And so you have to distinguish a bit the wheat from the chaff, in order at least know that when you're looking at a certain particular time in history, a particular work, there's never such a thing like pure objectivity. In order at least a few historians will actually seek that, right? To me, for example, when you read, I don't know, Caesar, that's one of the most straightforwardly objective historians, regardless of the, pro-Celticistic whinery about the terrible Romans lying, their propaganda, etc. Even though nobody explains how the Gauls were conquered in 8 years for good by Rome, as the best of the most advanced of the Celtic world, by the way. That's surely, a Roman made-up, right? But really, like, we have people say, the British Islands were never conquered by the Romans. Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah. But we have some real mental deficiencies at some point. And when you read Caesar, for example, you understand that compared to these other sources, by being more primarily traditional and sticking to, in fact, also morally and scientifically objectivizable and as objective indicators, he's telling you much more about that kind of engagement, of how it actually went, even without numbers, without sizes, whatever, but just speaking of the spirit, of the psychology of the troops, of the commanders, and still making an incredibly straightforwardly logical, strategic analysis in everything he's talking about, right? One of the most straightforward indicators of, a source like Caesar's reliability is obviously enough the crystal military logic in every single description that he makes. Like, there's not a passage by Caesar in which, the general theater, the picture does not make any sense, right? It's not because he inflated, say, the numbers of the Gauls at Alesia that, the Battle of Alesia did not witness like a massive relief force from the Celts, or the entire dynamic of the siege did not actually go that way, all right? But it's deeper, right? You can't make up this. It's not like disconnected episode from one another. It's the entire picture that literally tells you what's happening there. And especially not even anyone at the time had anything to say against that, nor later, because that was how it obviously went. And especially from a source who was so high in tradition, in authority, in primal Indo-European sagas, theological, metaphysical understanding. The Fortuna Caesaris, the deeper understanding of the same Celts, the Germans, the same Romans, that, as the Romans said themselves, ubi major minor cessat, right? And these works are etched in eternity because of the eternal meaning and worth that men like Caesar actually had. So when you read them, you're not just understanding warfare at a higher level, as in fact, the later millennia would study him like crazy. I mean, we're talking about military treatise regarding Vegetius. Yes, that was the only one. Of course, Caesar was known. I mean, and that's not a military treatise. It's just a military history. But obviously it was coupled with it. And so you have, at that point, a scale, a level of awareness in a broader literary sense that is impossible not to, aside from the fact that everybody knowing Caesar's life, knows how educated he was, how much he was, for example, an incredibly talented poet, along the traditional pattern of the warrior poet, of the scholar in the Roman oligarchy, in that sense of, a spiritual comprehensivity, right? That it's the same one that we've seen with Pyrrhus writing about a tactic of his times. That was a duty, in a sense, as a Greek, right, in the wake of the Macedonian tradition, to mold the world through an explanation of what the principles of tactics really were, right? It's the Dorians who founded the Omphalos of the world in Delphi and set the premises of the foundation. Hence, they had to escalate things at a theoretical, conceptual level. That's where that Hellenic and later Byzantine mentality that we find more abstract and crystallized. The Romans had to redeem the world and dominate the universe and augment it to a higher level. And it tells you, properly the concreteness of it, how it happens, what's happening from an individually spiritual point of view. And it's amazing. It speaks volumes about the height of the Roman civilization in the history of mankind. It's something unspeakable. And that's why it's sad that we banalize history to this point, as we don't seem to have any broader articulation of these concepts anywhere. It's as if, again, we completely bailed out of this, as if there was no meaning to anything. Everything is about skepticism and how bad people are and propaganda. This is the reflection of people's mental illness and paranoia, and lesser people forte state, mental filth, and this is the product of today's world. Like that is how low the humanity has fallen compared to these times, and it can't be denied that things were going the direction that we're sadly witnessing. But in a sense, reading these sources also in diachronic and comparative perspective, as we always do, as we did today, is a bit the ultimate necessity for this. We surpassed the 2 hours. I'm glad, as always, when we make these kind of videos. For today, however, stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.